The sound of wedding vows echoing through my living room was not how I planned to discover someone had taken over my house. The first thing that hit me wasn't the sight. It was the smell. Fresh-cut roses. Expensive perfume. Something catered, buttery and rich, drifting through the open front windows like it belonged there. Then came the music. Soft piano. The kind you hear in high-end ceremonies, floating out onto the driveway I had paid for, standing on concrete that still had chalk markings from the renovation crew I'd scheduled for next week. I hadn't even unlocked the front door yet. I just stood there, keys in my hand, staring at a line of luxury cars stretching down the street. BMWs, a white Range Rover, even a vintage Bentley parked halfway over my neighbor's curb like it owned the place. My place. I remember the crunch of gravel under my boots as I stepped forward, slow, deliberate, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. White folding chairs lined my front lawn. Perfect rows. A floral arch anchored right into the grass I hadn't even finished reseeding. And through the wide-open front door, I could see it. My living room, stripped of the few tools I'd left behind, now filled with strangers in formal wear, all facing the same direction, all watching something unfold where my fireplace used to be. I didn't say a word. Not yet. A man in a black suit stepped in front of me before I even reached the walkway. Security. Clipboard in hand, earpiece, the whole performance. Private event, he said, like he'd rehearsed it. His hand came up just enough to block me without actually touching me. Invitation. I looked at him, then past him, then back at my house. Yeah, I said slowly, feeling that metallic edge settle in the back of my throat. I've got one. It's called a property deed. He didn't laugh. He didn't move either. Behind him, I heard it, the officiant's voice rising just enough to carry through the open doorway. Dearly beloved. I exhaled once through my nose, steady, controlled. That's when I noticed the sign, mounted right beside my mailbox, staked into the ground like it had always been there. Elegant script, gold lettering, Whitmore Wedding, Rebecca Whitmore. Of course it was. HOA president. Self-appointed ruler of anything within a 5-block radius. The woman who once fined me $200 for leaving construction materials visible for less than 24 hours. The woman who walked through neighborhoods like she owned the land beneath every house. I hadn't even officially moved in yet. I bought the place 3 weeks ago. Paid cash. Needed work, nothing structural, just a full interior overhaul. New wiring, flooring, the kind of project you plan carefully because timing matters. Permits matter. Paperwork matters. And I had done all of that. Every form filed. Every approval stamped. Including one detail Rebecca clearly didn't know about. But standing there, watching guests sip champagne on my front porch like it was a rented venue, I realized something else first. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This was deliberate. I stepped sideways, just enough to get a better angle through the doorway. The bride stood near the fireplace, white dress catching the light from the windows I had installed last week. Someone had moved my ladder, my tools, everything gone, replaced with flowers, candles, rented elegance layered over someone else's property like it could erase ownership. My ownership. I checked my watch. 3:12 p.m. Right on schedule. The piano shifted into a softer progression. The room went quieter. The kind of silence people hold when something important is about to happen. I could feel eyes on me now. Guests noticing the guy standing outside who clearly didn't belong in their version of this story. The security guard adjusted his stance. Firmer this time. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I looked at him again. Really looked at him. Then I smiled, just slightly. Not enough to be friendly. Just enough to mean something else entirely. That's the interesting part. I said calm, even. I'm not going anywhere. Because what he didn't know. What Rebecca didn't know. What none of them inside my house had any idea about. Was that this entire event was happening right in the middle of a legal window I had been planning for weeks. And I had already made a call. The guard shifted his weight like. He was deciding whether I was a problem or just another confused guest. And I could hear the faint clink of glasses inside as people raised champagne to a life that had nothing to do with them being in my house. the late afternoon sun hitting the polished floors I had paid to refinish just days earlier, reflecting off rented decorations like it all belonged there, and I just stood still long enough to let the moment settle, because moments like this tell you everything about how far someone is willing to go when they think no one is going to push back, and Rebecca Whitmore had gone very far, farther than a fine or a complaint or one of her carefully worded violation letters. She had crossed into something deliberate and calculated, and that kind of move always leaves a trail if you know where to look. So I took one slow step back from the guard, not retreating, just repositioning, giving myself a wider view of the entire setup, the catering van parked halfway on my driveway with its back doors open, stainless steel trays stacked with food I never approved, extension cords running from inside my garage to power warmers. Someone had even plugged into the temporary outlet my electrician installed for the renovation crew, and that detail almost made me laugh because it meant they had been inside, not just once but long enough to make themselves comfortable, long enough to treat my property like a venue instead of someone else's investment. And that told me this had not been a last-minute decision. This had been planned, coordinated, scheduled, probably weeks in advance, and I already knew exactly when that timeline started, about 14 days ago, when I got the first message from the Homeowners Association, a vague email about property condition review and community alignment, the kind of language Rebecca liked to hide behind when she wanted to make something sound official without actually saying what she was doing. I had been in my contractor's office at the time going over flooring samples when that message came through, and I remember the smell of fresh sawdust and coffee mixing in the air while I skimmed it. Nothing urgent, nothing that required immediate action, just another HOA notice trying to insert itself into something it did not control, or at least that was what I thought back then, because 2 days after that I got another notice, this one about temporary access coordination, which made less sense at the time but makes perfect sense now, because that was the moment they started preparing to use my property without me, the moment they began building their version of reality where my house was just another empty structure, waiting to be assigned a purpose by someone like Rebecca. And I can still picture her the last time I saw her in person, standing at the edge of my driveway in a white SUV, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, smiling like she was doing me a favor by stopping by. Her perfume carried on the breeze before she even said a word, that same artificial sweetness layered over something sharp underneath, just making sure everything stays within community standards, she had said, glancing past me into the house like she was already imagining it staged, decorated, controlled, and I remember nodding, not agreeing, just acknowledging, because I had already learned something important about people like her. They do not listen, they observe, they measure, they wait for an opening, and the second they think they have one, they move fast, faster than most people are prepared to respond, and that is exactly what she did, because while I was finalizing permits and scheduling contractors, she was coordinating vendors, booking caterers, sending out invitations, building an entire event on top of something she did not own. And the more I looked around now, the clearer that became: the valet stand near the curb, the portable restrooms tucked discreetly behind my side fence, the florist van still idling down the block. This was not just a small gathering, this was a full-scale operation, and every piece of it depended on one assumption: that I would not show up, or if I did, that I would not know what to do, that I would argue, get emotional, call the police, create a scene that could be managed, contained, redirected. But what she did not understand is that I had already seen this kind of thinking before, not in neighborhoods but in contracts, in development deals, in situations where people tried to leverage timing and perception to take control of something that was not theirs. And the solution was never to react immediately, the solution was to let them commit fully, to let them invest time, money, reputation into a position they could not defend once the right moment arrived. And as I stood there listening to the efficient pause for effect inside my living room, the guests leaning forward in anticipation, the bride adjusting her veil under lighting I had not approved, I felt that moment getting closer, steady and precise, like a clock ticking down to something inevitable, and I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and checked the time again. 3:17 p.m., 5 minutes later than planned but still well within the window, and I could already hear it in the distance if I focused, low at first, almost blending into the background noise of traffic and music, but distinct enough once you knew what to listen for: the deep mechanical rumble of diesel engines moving in formation. Not fast, not aggressive, just steady, controlled, and exactly on schedule, and I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the situation shift in my favor without saying another word, because everything that was about to happen had already been set in motion long before Rebecca Whitmore decided to turn my house into her event space. I heard the engines before anyone else did, low and steady, like distant thunder rolling across pavement, and for a second I just let it sit there in the background while the ceremony inside my house kept moving forward, the officiant's voice rising again, smooth and practiced, guiding two strangers through vows they probably thought would be the most memorable part of their day, and I almost felt bad for them, almost, because none of this was actually theirs, not the space, not the setup, not even the timing, all of it borrowed from a decision someone else made without permission, and borrowed things have a way of being taken back at the worst possible moment. I took another step toward the walkway, and this time the guard shifted faster, more assertive, like he had decided I was no longer just confused. "Sir, you need to leave now," he said, firmer, louder, drawing a few glances from guests near the entrance. And that was when Rebecca appeared, like she had been waiting for exactly this moment, stepping out from the side of the house in a tailored dress that matched the color scheme, clipboard gone now, replaced with a smile that looked polished enough to sell the situation to anyone who did not know better. "Ethan," she said, like we were neighbors having a casual conversation instead of standing on property she had taken control of. "I was wondering if you might show up." Her tone carried that same artificial calm, the kind that assumes control simply by refusing to acknowledge reality. I tilted my head slightly, studying her, noticing how comfortable she looked surrounded by something she had no legal right to. "You booked my house?" I said, not a question, just a statement, and she gave a small shrug like it was nothing more than a scheduling detail. The property appeared and used, and we had a community request for a venue. Everything has been arranged professionally, vendors, permits, insurance. She emphasized that last word like it solved everything, like paperwork could replace ownership, and behind her I could see guests beginning to whisper, phones coming out, the subtle shift that happens when people sense something is not quite right but are not sure who is in the wrong yet. And Rebecca stepped a little closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound reasonable. "There is no need to create a scene, Ethan. We can discuss compensation after the event. I am sure we can come to an agreement that benefits everyone." I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed exactly what I needed to know. She thought this was a negotiation. She thought this was a situation that could be smoothed over with money and language and the illusion of authority. And that meant she had committed fully. There was no backup plan, no hesitation, just confidence built on the assumption that I would react the way most people do when caught off guard. But I did not respond, not to her, not to the guard, not to the guests watching from the doorway. I just listened, because the sound was closer now, clearer. The rumble of heavy equipment turning onto the street, diesel engines idling with that deep mechanical rhythm you feel more than hear. And I saw the first reaction ripple through the crowd as a few heads turned toward the road. Confusion spreading in small waves, the valet stepping back to look, the caterer pausing mid-step with a tray in his hands, and Rebecca's expression flickered for just a fraction of a second before she caught it, before she tried to maintain that same controlled composure. But it was already too late because the lead truck came into view, bright orange markings, company name printed clearly on the side, followed by another and then another, a convoy moving slowly but deliberately, like they had done this 100 times before, and I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folded document I had been carrying all afternoon. The paper, crisp, edges sharp, official stamps visible even from a distance. I did not rush. I did not raise my voice. I just unfolded it carefully while the engines idled louder, filling the space between the ceremony music and the sudden silence that had started to creep in from outside. "You said permits?" I said calmly, finally looking directly at Rebecca again. And this time I did let the smile show, just enough to signal the shift she was not ready for. "So did I." I held the document up just enough for her to see the header, the city seal, the approval date, and most importantly the classification printed in bold across the top. And I watched the moment it registered, the exact second her confidence started to crack, because what she did not expect, what none of them expected, was that while they were planning a wedding inside my house, I had already scheduled something else for the exact same time, something fully approved, fully legal, and impossible to ignore once it started. And the engines outside did not stop. They did not hesitate. They just kept idling, waiting for the signal that was already seconds away. The silence hit before the noise did. That strange moment where a crowd realizes something is wrong but does not yet understand how wrong it is, and I watched it spread from the edge of the driveway all the way through my open front door, past the rows of white chairs, past the floral arch, into the center of my living room where the officiant had just stopped mid-sentence. His hand still raised like he was holding on to the moment, waiting for it to continue, but it did not, because the engines outside had grown too loud to ignore now, a steady mechanical presence that did not belong to a wedding, did not belong to anything delicate or temporary, and Rebecca turned toward the street fully this time, her composure tightening around the edges. "What is this?" she asked, not to me, not to anyone specific, just out loud like the question itself might fix what she was starting to understand. And I did not rush to answer. I just took a step forward onto my own walkway, feeling the smooth concrete under my boots, hearing the faint crunch of gravel shift behind me as the first truck came to a complete stop at the curb, followed by the second and the third, each one idling with that low, controlled hum that carries authority without needing volume, and the company logo on the side was clear enough for anyone paying attention. Not hidden, not subtle, just professional and official in a way that does not ask for permission once the paperwork is in place. The driver of the lead vehicle opened his door and stepped down, clipboard in hand, safety vest catching the late afternoon light, and he did not look confused, he did not hesitate. He scanned the property once, then looked directly at me like he already knew exactly who he was here for. "Mr. Cole?" he called out, voice steady, practiced, and I nodded once, calm, precise, and that was all he needed, because everything after that followed a process that had been scheduled, approved, and confirmed long before Rebecca decided to turn my house into something she could control, and I could feel the shift. Behind me as guests began to stand, chairs scraping softly against the floor inside, whispers turning into questions, phones lifting higher now, recording instead of just observing, and Rebecca stepped closer again, faster this time, the edge in her voice no longer hidden. "You cannot bring construction equipment onto this property during a private event," she said, each word measured like she was trying to reassert control through language alone, and I finally turned to face her fully, holding the document out just enough for her to see it clearly. The city seal, the permit number, the approval date that matched today exactly. "It is not construction," I said evenly, letting the words land without force. "It is scheduled demolition and structural preparation, authorized by the city and filed 2 weeks before your event was even booked." And I watched the realization hit her in layers, first confusion, then disbelief, then that sharp flicker of calculation as she tried to find a way around something that had already closed every door. And the driver walked up the driveway beside me, flipping a page on his clipboard. "We have full clearance for exterior and interior prep work, starting at 1,500 hours. He said, not looking at Rebecca, not engaging with her at all, just confirming the timeline with me like the rest of the situation did not exist. And I glanced at my watch again, 3:28 p.m., a few minutes past the start time, but still within the permitted window. "You are clear to proceed," I said, calm, simple, and that was the moment everything shifted completely, because now it was not about arguing or authority or perception anymore. It was about process, legal, documented process that does not pause for inconvenience. And the first piece of equipment moved, slow and controlled, not aggressive, just deliberate, rolling forward enough to make its presence undeniable. The sound of its engine filling the space where wedding music had been seconds earlier, and inside my house I could see the bride lower her hands, confusion replacing whatever emotion had been there before, guests stepping back, the officiant lowering his book, the entire scene unraveling not through chaos but through certainty, the kind that comes from realizing you are standing in the wrong place at the wrong time with no claim to either. And Rebecca reached out slightly, not touching me, not touching the driver, just caught in that moment where action no longer has a clear direction. "This is a mistake," she said, quieter now, less certain, and I shook my head once, not dismissive, just final. "No," I said, meeting her eyes for the first time without any need to hold back. "The mistake was assuming you could use something that was never yours to begin with." And the engines did not stop, the process did not pause, and for the first time since I arrived, the house behind her looked exactly what it was again. Not a venue, not a stage, just a property under my control, moving forward exactly as planned. The moment the first machine rolled forward, the illusion collapsed completely, not with shouting or chaos, but with that quiet, unmistakable shift when people realized the ground under them was never theirs. And I watched it happen in real time as guests began stepping backward, careful at first, like they were trying not to disrupt something that was already gone. Heels sinking slightly into the edge of the lawn, dress shoes scraping against the concrete of my walkway, the soft rustle of formal wear replacing the music that had faded out minutes ago, and inside the house the change was even sharper. The bride turned toward the doorway, her expression no longer focused or emotional but searching, confused, trying to understand why the space around her was no longer holding together the way it had just moments before. The officiant lowered his hands completely now, his voice gone. His role finished without ever reaching the part he had been hired for, and I could see the caterers. Pausing mid-motion, trays held awkwardly as they waited for direction that was not coming. Because there was no direction left to give, only reality settling in piece by piece, and the crew outside did not rush, they never do. They moved with the kind of controlled efficiency that comes from routine, checking boundaries, confirming markers, one of them placing small flags along the edge of the driveway, another measuring distance from the front structure to the curb, every action quiet but precise, each one reinforcing the same fact without needing to say it out loud. This property was now operating under a different set of rules, and Rebecca stood in the middle of it, no longer at the center of control but at the edge of something she could not redirect. Her posture still upright but tighter now, her hands no longer relaxed, fingers pressed together like she was holding on to something slipping away. "You are disrupting a private event," she said again, but the words did not carry the same weight this time. They sounded thinner, less anchored, like they were meant for an audience that had already stopped listening, and I did not raise my voice when I answered. I did not need to. "No," I said, steady, clear. "I am continuing a scheduled project on my property." And I could see a few guests exchange looks, subtle but telling, the kind that say everything without needing conversation. Because once that distinction is understood, everything else becomes obvious, and one of the crew members stepped closer to the entrance, not crossing the threshold. Just enough to be seen, holding a copy of the permit in a clear sleeve, the same document I had shown Rebecca, and he spoke in that same measured tone they all use. "We need the area cleared for safety compliance." No urgency, no aggression, just a statement of procedure, and that was the moment the unraveling accelerated, because now it was not about opinion or authority anymore, it was about compliance, and compliance does not negotiate with inconvenience. The guests closest to the door began moving first, stepping aside, some quietly gathering their belongings, others still watching like they were trying to decide if this was part of the event or something entirely different. The bride's shoulders lowered slightly, the weight of the moment shifting into something she had not planned for, and someone from the catering team began unplugging equipment, the soft click of power cords coming loose echoing in the quiet space, one small action after another, each one pulling the scene apart without force, without confrontation, just inevitability. And Rebecca turned back to me again, her voice lower now, controlled but edged with something sharper underneath. "You will be responsible for this disruption," she said, choosing her words carefully, and I held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, not challenging, just certain. "No," I said again, the same calm tone, the same finality. "The responsibility started the moment you decided to use something that did not belong to you." And I could see it land, not fully accepted, not yet, but understood enough to stop the argument from continuing in the same way, because there was no angle left to push, no authority left to claim, just a situation moving forward exactly as documented, exactly as approved, and the crew continued their process, marking, measuring, preparing, the low hum of the engines filling the space where celebration had been minutes earlier, and for the first time since I arrived, there was no confusion left in the air, no question about who controlled the outcome, just a clear, steady progression from assumption to consequence, unfolding in front of everyone who had shown up expecting something entirely different. The air felt different now, heavier, not because anything had physically changed yet, but because everyone standing on that lawn understood they were no longer part of a celebration. They were standing inside a mistake that was unfolding in real time, and mistakes like this do not correct themselves quietly. They get documented, they get witnessed, and most importantly, they get remembered. And I could see that realization spreading through the crowd as more guests stepped away from the house. Heels clicking faster now on the driveway, voices rising just enough to break the careful silence that had been holding everything together. Not loud, not chaotic, just uncertain, like people trying to find an exit from something they had not signed up for. And the bride was no longer near the center of the room. She had moved closer to the doorway, her dress gathered slightly in one hand to keep it from brushing against the threshold. Her eyes moving between Rebecca, the crew, and me, searching for a version of this situation that made sense. But there was none, not anymore, and the groom stood beside her, one hand on his jacket, posture rigid, like he was trying to stay composed. In front of a room that was no longer focused on him, And that was the part that always shifts first attention. Once it leaves, it does not come back the same way, and the crew outside continued without pause, one of them placing bright markers along the edge of the structure, another checking measurements against a printed layout, the faint sound of a tape measure snapping back into place cutting through the quiet, small details that most people would ignore but in this moment felt louder than any music that had played earlier, and I noticed one of the neighbors standing across the street now, arms crossed, watching with the kind of interest that only comes when something unusual happens close to home, and then another neighbor stepped out, then another, drawn by the sound, by the presence of equipment that did not belong to a wedding, and that is when the scene expanded beyond the guests, beyond the event, into something public, something that could not be contained within the boundaries Rebecca had tried to create, and she felt it. I could see it in the way her posture shifted again, not collapsing, not yet, but adjusting, recalculating. "You need to stop this immediately," she said, stepping closer to the crew member nearest the entrance, her voice sharper now, less controlled, and he did not react the way she expected. He did not argue, did not engage. He simply held up his clipboard slightly, indicating the permit, the schedule, the authority that did not require her approval. "Ma'am, we are operating under city authorization," he said calmly, the same tone he had used before. And that was the difference she could not overcome, because her authority depended on perception, on compliance, on people choosing to follow her version of the rules. But this was not that. This was processed, documented, filed, approved, and already in motion, and I could see her glance around, looking for support, for agreement, for someone to reinforce her position. But the crowd had already shifted, their focus no longer on her, no longer on the event, but on what was happening, what was changing, and what that meant, and one of the catering staff rolled a cart slowly down the walkway, wheels clicking softly over the seams in the concrete, trays covered now, no longer presented, just being removed, and another staff member followed with a bundle of folded linens, the white fabric losing its shape as it was gathered. No longer part of a coordinated design, just material being taken away, and that is how it always goes, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a series of small reversals, each one undoing a piece of what had been carefully arranged. And I stayed where I was, not moving forward, not stepping back, just watching the process unfold, feeling the timing align exactly the way it was supposed to, because this was never about reacting to Rebecca, it was about letting her complete the setup, letting her invest everything into a moment that could not hold once the reality underneath it was revealed, and now that moment had passed, replaced by something far more solid, far more permanent, and the sound of one of the machines adjusting position, its engine shifting tones slightly as it settled into place, filled the space again, grounding everything in a way that left no room for interpretation, and Rebecca looked at me one more time, her expression no longer confident, no longer controlled, just searching, trying to find something she could still use, something she could still claim. But there was nothing left, no angle, no argument, no authority that applied here, and I met her gaze calmly, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just certainty, because everything that needed to happen was already happening. Exactly on schedule, exactly as planned. By the time the last of the guests stepped off the lawn, the entire atmosphere had shifted from confusion to quiet retreat. Not rushed, not chaotic, just a steady movement away from something that no longer made sense to stay in. And I watched as the bride finally crossed the threshold, careful with each step, her dress lifted slightly to keep it clean, though that detail no longer mattered the way it had an hour ago, and the groom followed close behind, speaking to her in a low voice I could not hear, his hand hovering near her back like he was unsure whether to guide or simply stay close, and that hesitation said more than anything else, because this was not a moment they had planned for, not something anyone prepares for when they accept an invitation printed on heavy cardstock with gold lettering. And one of the event coordinators moved quickly now, gathering a stack of programs from a small table near the entrance, the paper edges bending as they were collected without care, no longer part of a presentation but just items to be removed, and the sound of folding chairs being lifted and stacked inside carried out through the open doorway, a hollow metallic rhythm replacing the earlier music, each movement reinforcing the same reality. This event was over, not by announcement, not by decision, but by circumstance that could not be reversed, and Rebecca stood near the walkway, no longer trying to direct anyone, her presence still there but without the structure that had supported it, and I could see the moment she understood that nothing she said next would change the outcome, that this was no longer about controlling perception but about dealing with consequence, and she looked at the crew again, then back at me as if searching for some final leverage, something she could still use to reframe what was happening. But there was nothing left to reframe, No angle that would turn this back into something she could manage, and one of the crew members walked past her carrying a set of marked stakes, placing them carefully along the edge of the front steps, measuring twice before pressing each one into the ground, his movements deliberate, practiced, unaffected by the situation around him, because for him this was just another job, another site, another timeline to follow, and that contrast made everything even clearer, because while this moment felt unique to everyone else, to him it was routine, and routine does not stop for unexpected gatherings. It follows the plan that was approved, the schedule that was set, and I took a slow breath, feeling the last of the tension settle into something steady, something resolved, and across the street more neighbors had gathered now, standing in small clusters, watching, some with phones raised, others just observing with that quiet curiosity that comes when something unusual breaks the normal rhythm of a neighborhood, and their presence added another layer to the situation, turning what might have been contained into something visible, something that would be talked about long after the last piece of equipment left, and Rebecca noticed them too, her gaze shifting briefly before returning to me, and this time when she spoke, her voice was lower, controlled again but different, less certain. "This is not how this ends," she said, not as a statement of authority but as something closer to a promise she was trying to make to herself, and I held her gaze for a moment, then shook my head slightly, not dismissing her, just clarifying something she had not yet accepted. "It already ended?" I said calmly, letting the words settle without force, because the ending had not happened in a single moment, it had unfolded piece by piece, starting long before today, and now it was simply visible to everyone who had shown up expecting something else, and the crew continued their work, one of them signaling to the operator in the lead machine. A small hand gesture that carried more authority than anything Rebecca had said all afternoon, and the engine responded with a slight change in tone, not louder, just different, ready, aligned with the next step in the process, and I could feel the timing again, precise, controlled, exactly where it needed to be, and as the last of the guests moved toward their cars, the driveway slowly clearing of vehicles that had arrived under a different assumption, the space began to open up, returning to its original purpose, not as a venue, not as a stage, but as a property under my control, moving forward exactly as planned, and for the first time since I arrived, there was nothing left to interrupt that progression, nothing left to delay what was already in motion, just the steady, measured continuation of a plan that had never belonged to anyone else. The moment the driveway cleared, everything accelerated in a way that felt both controlled and irreversible, like a switch had finally been flipped from hesitation to execution, and I could see it. In the crew's body language, the subtle tightening of movements, the quick confirmations between them, the way one operator leaned slightly out of the cab to get a better angle while another checked the boundary markers one last time, and the low hum of the engines shifted into something more purposeful, not louder, just more focused, like every piece of equipment had moved from waiting to doing, and the last catering cart rolled past me toward the street, its wheels rattling softly over the uneven edge of the curb, the scent of food fading quickly into the open air, replaced by something sharper, cleaner, the faint metallic scent of machinery warming under steady use, and inside the house the transformation was already visible, decorations being taken down in uneven sections, flowers removed from surfaces they never belonged to, chairs stacked in corners where moments ago people had been sitting in expectation of something meaningful. And now it all looked temporary again, fragile, like it had always been, and I stepped forward onto the porch for the first time since arriving, the wood creaking slightly under my weight, a familiar sound that grounded everything back into place, reminding me exactly why I had bought this property, why I had planned every detail of what was coming next, and why none of what Rebecca had done could ever hold against that. And as I crossed the threshold into the living room, I paused for a second, just long enough to take in the space as it was now, half transformed, half undone, the outline of what had been set up still visible but fading with each passing second, and one of the crew members appeared beside the doorway, not entering yet, just waiting for the final confirmation, and I nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that carried more weight than anything said out loud, and that was all it took, because the next phase did not require discussion, it required action, and outside the first machine adjusted its position with a smooth, controlled movement, its presence filling the space in a way that no decoration ever could. Not overwhelming, not aggressive, just undeniable, and I could hear Rebecca behind me now, her steps slower, less certain, following at a distance like she was trying to stay close to something that was already moving beyond her reach. "You cannot do this today," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, they sounded disconnected from the reality around us, because today had already been decided long before she ever sent out an invitation. And I did not turn around when I answered. I kept my focus forward, on the space that was finally returning to its intended purpose. "It was scheduled. Weeks ago," I said calmly, my voice steady against the background of engines and movement, and I could feel her pause behind me, not because she had accepted it, but because she had nothing left to counter it with, and that was the difference that mattered, not agreement, not understanding, just the absence of control. And one of the crew members stepped inside now, carrying a set of tools, his movements careful, precise, placing them down near the marked area without disrupting anything that did not need to be touched yet, because even this part of the process followed a sequence. Nothing rushed, nothing random, every action tied to a plan that had already been approved and documented. And outside I could see more neighbors gathering along the sidewalk, their conversations low but constant, the kind of background noise that builds when something unusual becomes undeniable. And I knew this moment would travel, not just through the neighborhood but through every conversation that followed, because people remember when something that looks controlled suddenly is not, and they remember even more when they realize it never was. And I stepped back out onto the porch, giving the crew space to continue, watching as the final pieces of the event disappeared, the last of the decorations removed, the last guests leaving, the driveway now almost empty except for the equipment that had been there all along in my plans, and Rebecca stood at the edge of it, no longer trying to intervene, no longer directing anything, just present in a situation that had moved completely beyond her. And for a brief second our eyes met again, and there was nothing left to say, because everything that mattered had already been decided, already been set in motion, and now it was simply being carried out exactly as it was meant to be. By the time the sun dropped low enough to cast long shadows across the driveway, there was nothing left of the event except faint impressions in the grass and a few scattered petals caught along the edge of the porch, small traces of something that had tried to exist where it never belonged, and the steady rhythm of the work had taken over completely, not loud, not chaotic, just consistent, methodical, the kind of progress that does not need attention to continue. And I stood near the edge of the property, watching as the crew moved through their final checks for the day, tools being gathered, markers adjusted, notes taken on clipboards that reflected exactly what had been completed and what would continue in the morning. And the air smelled different now, cleaner somehow, stripped of the artificial layers that had been placed over it earlier, replaced by something real, something grounded in the actual purpose of the space. And across the street the last of the neighbors lingered, a little longer than necessary, conversations quieter now, less curious and more reflective, because what they had witnessed was not just an interruption, it was a correction, and people recognized that even if they do not say it out loud. And Rebecca was still there, standing near the sidewalk where the event signage had been removed hours ago, her posture no longer rigid, no longer controlled, just still, like she was trying to process something that had not gone the way she expected. And for a moment I considered saying something else, something that might explain it in a way she could accept. But then I realized that explanations only matter when someone is willing to hear them, and she had already been given everything she needed to understand, just not in the way she wanted. And one of the crew members walked past me with a nod, a simple acknowledgement that the day's work had gone according to plan, and I returned it without words, because there was nothing left to confirm. Everything had already been executed exactly as it was supposed to be, and I took a slow breath, letting the quiet settle in fully for the first time since I arrived. No music, no voices raised in celebration or argument, just the natural sounds of a neighborhood returning to its normal rhythm. And I stepped onto the porch again, looking through the open doorway into the space that had been temporarily transformed and then restored to its intended state, the walls bare, the floors clear, the structure unchanged by everything that had passed through it. And that was the part that mattered most, not what had been placed inside it for a few hours, but what it actually was and what it was going to become moving forward. And I reached into my pocket and unfolded the permit one more time, not because I needed to read it again, but because it represented something simple and absolute, a plan followed, a process respected, a boundary enforced without needing to raise my voice or break my composure. And I folded it carefully and put it away, the paper crisp against my fingers, a small detail that grounded everything back into something tangible. And behind me I heard footsteps approach, slowly, measured, and I knew without turning that it was Rebecca, because no one else would still be here at this point. And she stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak but not close enough to claim any space that was not hers. And when she finally did speak, Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of the confidence it carried earlier. "You could have handled this differently?" she said, and I let the words sit for a moment, not dismissing them, just considering them in the context of everything that had already happened. And then I turned slightly, enough to meet her eyes without stepping away from where I stood. "So could you?" I said calmly, not as an accusation, just as a fact. And there was nothing left to add after that, no argument to continue, no authority to challenge. Just two people standing on opposite sides of a line that had finally been made clear, and she held my gaze for a second longer, then looked away, the weight of the situation settling in a way that did not need further explanation. And after a moment she turned and walked back toward the street, her steps slower than before, not rushed, not dramatic, just leaving, and I watched her go until she reached her car, the door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed to mark the end of something larger than just the day's events. And as the last of the crew prepared to leave, engines powering down one by one, the quiet returned fully, steady and complete, and I stood there for a moment longer, taking it in, the stillness, the space, the clarity of what had just unfolded, and I could not help but think about how easily it could have gone a different way if I had reacted instead of planned, if I had argued instead of documented, if I had tried to match